The image of Sharon Osbourne that the world knows is one of unshakable strength. For decades, she's been the formidable matriarch, the master strategist who pulled Ozzy back from the brink and built a metal empire. She's the woman who faced down record executives, managed chaos, and never, ever showed weakness. But recently, a crack appeared in that iron facade. On her own podcast, at 72 years old, Sharon was discussing the early days of Ozzy's solo career when her voice began to break. Within moments, the tough-as-nails manager was completely overcome, sobbing uncontrollably. And the trigger for this raw, emotional collapse was the name of a guitarist who died over 40 years ago, Randy Rhoads. This wasn't a few quiet tears. This was a full breakdown. A flood of emotions so powerful it seemed to shock even her husband Ozzy, who was sitting beside her. It raises a haunting question. What memory, what long-buried truth could still hold so much power over her? What happened in those frantic make-or-break years that remains an open wound? The story she began to tell unravels a myth we all thought we knew. This isn't just a tribute to a lost guitar hero. This is a confession. It's the real story of a desperate gamble, a terrifying amount of pressure, and the one tragic event that nearly destroyed everything before it even really began. The truth about Randy Rhoads is really the truth about Sharon Osbourne. But to understand why this memory is so painful, you have to understand just how desperate the situation really was. We're talking 1979. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't a rock god. He was a shattered man, fired from Black Sabbath, drowning in addiction, and flat broke. The music industry viewed him as damaged goods, a lost cause. And into this absolute chaos stepped a 28-year-old Sharon Osbourne. She wasn't the powerful figure we know today. She was the daughter of the notoriously tough music manager Don Arden, and she was desperate to prove she could make it on her own, away from her father's shadow. Betting on Ozzy was the ultimate high-risk move. She poured every bit of her own money and her entire future into a man most people thought was finished. The pressure was immediate, and it was absolute. If this failed, she had nothing to go back to. This was it. And that's when a young, virtuoso guitar teacher from California named Randy Rhoads entered the picture, becoming the one glimmer of hope in what looked like a guaranteed disaster. And Randy Rhoads wasn't just a good guitarist. He was the miracle they didn't dare pray for. Imagine the scene. Sharon and Ozzy, drowning in uncertainty, holding auditions that felt hopeless. Then this kid, barely 21 years old, walks in with a beat-up guitar. He was quiet, polite, almost shy, the polar opposite of the rock and roll chaos that surrounded Ozzy. But the moment his fingers touched the strings, everything changed. The sound that came out of his amplifier was nothing short of revolutionary. It was classical music fused with explosive, raw metal power. He played riffs that sounded like they were from another planet. For Sharon, Randy was more than just a musician. He was the foundation of her entire plan. He was the undeniable talent that could make skeptical record executives finally take Ozzy seriously as a solo artist. His clean-cut image and sheer genius were the perfect counterbalance to Ozzy's wild, unpredictable persona. In Randy, Sharon saw the missing piece. He was the key to transforming a broken-down singer into a global phenomenon. He was their golden ticket, but securing that ticket meant placing an unimaginable weight on the shoulders of a young man who just wanted to play guitar, and the success that followed would bring a pressure cooker of stress that none of them were prepared for. What happened next should have been a pure victory lap, but behind the scenes, it was a nightmare of pressure closing in from all sides. The album Blizzard of Oz wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural earthquake that resurrected Ozzy's career overnight. But that sudden, explosive success meant the stakes were now higher than anyone could have imagined. Sharon wasn't just a manager anymore. She was the commander of a rapidly growing empire, and every single problem landed squarely on her desk. She was now responsible for managing Ozzy's increasingly chaotic behavior, keeping a volatile band together, handling millions of dollars, and answering to demanding record labels, all while being constantly scrutinized by a music press that was just waiting for this whole experiment to collapse. The stress was absolutely crushing. She had to be the tough negotiator, the calm mediator, and the unwavering rock all at once. There was no room for error, no moment of weakness allowed. Every day was a high-wire act, and the fear of failure was a constant, suffocating presence. The very dream she had fought for was now a monster that demanded everything from her. And just when it seemed the pressure couldn't get more intense, a single, unthinkable event would shatter the entire world she had built, proving that her worst fears were more real than she ever could have imagined. But in an instant, that fragile world of pressure and success was utterly obliterated. It was March 19th, 1982, a day that would forever be a black mark on rock history. The tour bus was parked at a small airstrip in Florida. What started as a reckless early morning joyride in a private plane turned into an unthinkable tragedy. The plane clipped the tour bus, spiraled out of control, and crashed into a nearby garage. On board were the pilot and two passengers, the band's hairdresser and Randy Rhoads. The news hit Sharon and Ozzy like a physical blow. The genius guitarist, the cornerstone of their entire new sound, the quiet young man they both loved like family, was just gone. The aftermath was a blur of shock, grief, and horror. Ozzy was absolutely devastated, falling into a deeper despair than anyone had ever seen. And Sharon? In the middle of her own heartbreak, she had to become a pillar. She had to handle the legal nightmares, the press frenzy, and somehow keep her husband from completely self-destructing. The dream had not just ended, it had exploded in the most tragic way imaginable, and the weight of everything that came next would leave a scar that, as we now know, still has the power to bring her to tears decades later. And this brings us back to the podcast, to the raw, unfiltered moment that shocked everyone. Sharon's tears weren't just about the grief of losing Randy, as profound as that grief is. The truth she revealed is far more personal. Her breakdown was the final release of a pressure that had been building for over 40 years. It was the confession of a terrified young woman who had to pretend she had everything under control. She wasn't the invincible manager then. She was a 28-year-old and way over her head, haunted by the terrifying thought that she was responsible for it all. Responsible for Ozzy's life, for Randy's safety, for the entire fragile machine. Randy's tragic death became the ultimate symbol of that fear, the devastating proof that even her best efforts couldn't prevent catastrophe. For decades, she carried the weight of that entire era, the guilt and the what-ifs buried beneath her tough exterior. The truth about Randy Rhoads is that his story is inextricably linked to Sharon's own battle with fear and the crushing weight of a responsibility that would have broken most people. It's a truth about survival and the hidden cost of building a legend. So what became of the people left to pick up the pieces? In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, the future of Ozzy Osbourne's career looked utterly impossible. How do you replace the irreplaceable? How do you make music again after such a profound loss? Ozzy fell into a deep, dark spiral, convinced the whole thing was a curse. But this is where Sharon's true strength, the strength we saw crack but never break, was tested like never before. She had to guide Ozzy through his grief while making impossible business decisions. Guitarists like Bernie Torme and Brad Gillis were brought in to finish the tour, a nearly insurmountable task that felt like walking on sacred ground. Somehow, they persevered. Albums like Bark at the Moon proved that Ozzy's career could continue, but the shadow of Randy Rhoads would loom over every note played by every guitarist who followed. They achieved a level of fame and success beyond their wildest dreams, but the cost was permanently etched into their souls. The memory of those frantic, hopeful, and ultimately tragic early days became the foundational trauma of their entire empire, a constant reminder of how high the stakes really were and how fragile it all truly is. The tough exterior the world sees was forged in the fire of that specific loss, which leaves us with one final, haunting question. Why now? After decades of silence, why did this memory finally break through? The answer might be simpler than we think. At 72, with the frantic pace of life behind her, Sharon Osbourne is finally looking back at the entire journey. The podcast moment wasn't a planned confession. It was a crack in the dam. It was the weight of that young woman's terror, a feeling she could never afford to show at the time, finally demanding to be heard. The truth about Randy Rhoads is not a scandalous secret about the guitarist, but a long-buried truth about the woman who helped build a legend. It's about the immense, hidden cost of success and the ghosts of what was lost along the way. It's a reminder that behind every iconic story, there are human struggles that time does not erase. Sharon Osbourne's tears were not a sign of weakness, but a testament to a pain that was always there, silently shaping one of rock and roll's most incredible survival stories.